Introduction to Research Ethics. There are 7 areas of scientific dishonesty. Plagiarism is using the ideas, writings, and drawings of others as your own. Fabrication and falsification is making up or altering data. Non-publication of data is also called cooking data. Faulty data, which could be an issue with the gathering procedure during our methodology. Poor data storage and retention. Where we store data and where we retain that information is extremely important. Misleading authorship. Who should be included as an author? Technicians do not necessarily become joint authors. Authorship should only involve those who contribute directly to the research. We should discuss authorship before beginning a project. And finally, sneaky publication practices. We can see joint publication, such as a graduate student and a faculty member, 2 or more graduate students, or 2 or more faculty members, such as the authorship of a If these individuals are included on the publication as authors, they need to have contributed equally to the data collection, processing, and writing of the academic piece. There are 3 different ethical dimensions. Philosophical is based on value systems and addresses the question of what do you believe. Praxis addresses the question of what do you do. And reflexivity is a combination of the previous 2 that addresses the question, how does power come to bear? The foundational pillars of ethical research include autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and fidelity. Autonomy is the right of the individual to determine what activities they will or will not participate in. Beneficence is the obligation of the researcher to maximize benefits for the research participants. Non-maleficence is preventing doing harm by omitting care or treatment to control groups. Justice is the equitable selection of participants and the absence of coercion or forced participation. And fidelity is building trust relationships between the researcher and research participants. Unfortunately, throughout history, there are multiple examples of unethical research, such as the following. We'll discuss some of these cases to better understand how our ethical considerations for research have come about. The study of eugenics is one example. The term eugenics means well-born and refers to a mindset that humanity could be improved by encouraging the fittest members of society to have more children. This is an arbitrary defined standard of perfection. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of the human population. This historically has been excluding people and groups judged to be inferior and promoting those judged to be superior. This concept dates all the way to ancient Greece, in which Plato suggested applying the principle of selective breeding to humans around 400 BC. Early advocates of eugenics emerged in the 19th century and regarded it as a way of improving groups of people. Many countries adopted eugenic policies intended to improve the quality of their population's genetic stock. The idea of a modern project for improving the human population through selective breeding was originally developed by Francis Galton and was initially inspired by Darwinism and its theory of natural selection. In an 1869 work, Galton assembled biographical information from obituaries and other sources and constructed pedigrees of the leading English families. He concluded that superior intelligence and abilities were inherited with an efficiency of 20%. During the late 19th and early 20th century, eugenics was generally accepted as a legitimate technique for societal improvement and was supported by prominent people such as Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt. It even became an academic discipline at Harvard, Dartmouth, MIT, and several other very well-respected higher educational institutions. In the United States between 1927 and 1970, there were upwards of 60,000 sterilizations performed, with over 20,000 occurring in California alone, although it is likely that there are more that were never recorded. Eugenics largely fell out of favor following World War II as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis used this theory to justify killing and sterilizing tens of thousands of people that were deemed unfit to reproduce. However, it did continue in the United States for several decades after that, even though it was mostly seen as an unfavorable practice at the time. Another example is the Tuskegee experiment. The Tuskegee experiment took place in Macon County, Alabama. In 1932, the Public Health Service was working with the Tuskegee Institute, and they began studying to record the natural history of syphilis in the hopes of justifying treatment programs for African Americans, or blacks. It was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male at the time. The study initially involved 600 black men, 399 with syphilis, and 201 who did not have the disease. The study was conducted without the benefit of the patient's informed consent. Researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe several ailments, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In truth, these individuals did not receive proper treatment needed to cure their illness. Unfortunately, at the time of the study, there was no known cure for syphilis. In exchange for taking part in the study, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. Although originally projected to last for 6 months, the study actually went on for 40 years. So what went wrong here? In July 1972, an Associated Press story about the Tuskegee study caused a public outcry. This led to a panel investigation from fields of medicine, law, religion, labor, education, health administration, and public affairs. This panel found that the men had agreed freely to be examined and treated. However, there was no evidence that researchers had informed them of the study or its real purpose. In fact, the men had been misled and had not been given all of the facts required to provide informed consent. The men were never given adequate treatment for their disease. Even when penicillin became the drug of choice for syphilis in 1947, researchers did not offer this treatment to the subjects. The advisory panel found nothing to show that the subjects were even given the choice of quitting the study, even when this new, highly effective treatment became widely used. In the summer of 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the study participants and their families. In 1974, a $10 million out-of-court settlement was reached. As part of the settlement, the U.S. government promised to give lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all living participants. In 1975, wives, widows, and offspring were added to the program. The last study participant died in January 2004. Another example is the Willowbrook study. Another example is the Willowbrook study. The Willowbrook study is a study that took place at Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, a school that was primarily used to educate mentally defective individuals. This study was designed to gain a better understanding of the natural history of infectious hepatitis and its response to various treatment protocols. The individuals were intentionally given hepatitis in the attempt to track the development of the viral infection. The study began in 1956 and lasted for 14 years. The researchers also wanted to determine the effectiveness of treatments, such as gamma globulin injections, as protection against hepatitis. The researchers justified their deliberate infections and exposure by claiming that given that there was a high rate of infection in the institution, it was practically inevitable that the children would become infected. One of the ethical problems with the Willowbrook hepatitis study is that it did not protect the participants from harm. New patients who were healthy were subjected to the infectious disease. Furthermore, researchers stated that the children would be more than likely to become infected during their time at Willowbrook. The symptoms of hepatitis A included swollen livers, yellowing of the skin and eyes, and a few days of vomiting and not eating. Another ethical issue was the recruitment of participants. This study involved mentally disabled children. Researchers knew that parents would want to find a facility that would take care of their child or children. Therefore, they recruited new patients by telling parents that the facility was overcrowded and their child would be accepted only if they participated in the study. The parents met the researchers, toured the facility, discussed the program with other parents, and spoke to private physicians about the facility. The researchers received consent from the parents, however, they did not fully disclose what the study entailed. Additionally, the study was conducted in an institution with unsanitary environments. This made the situation worse because the virus spread among the healthy participants. They could not isolate the carriers of the disease as they did not know who the carriers were. In the end, more than 700 children were all deliberately infected with hepatitis so that their responses to the virus could be monitored and recorded. The Milgram Obedience Study is another example. One of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology was carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He conducted an experiment focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal consciousness. Milgram, in 1963, examined the justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. Their defense was often based on obedience, that they were just following orders from their superiors. The experiments began in July of 1961, a year after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised an experiment to answer the question, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? His hypothesis was that people will obey either out of fear or as a result of their desire to appear cooperative. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by newspaper advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participants were paired with another person, and they drew lots to find out who was the learner and who was the teacher. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher, and the learner was one of Milgram's research assistants, pretending to be a real participant. The learner, who was called in the research Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms. The teacher and the researcher went into a room next door that contained an electrical shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, slight shock, to 375 volts, danger, severe shock, to 450 volts, which indicated possible death. Milgram was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was asked to learn a list of paired words. The teacher would then test him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner or pair from the list of 4 possible choices. The teacher was told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose, and for each of these, the teacher gave the individual an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was to give a series of orders or prods to ensure that they continued. There were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter, Mr. Williams, read aloud the next prod and so on. The results of this study were amazing. 65% of the teachers were willing to progress to the maximum of 450 volts. Milgram did more than one experiment. He carried out 18 variations of his study. All he did was alter the situation to see how this affected obedience. In other studies, a control group was established to determine that the teachers were not inherently evil or mean people. The conclusion of this study was that ordinary people were likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in all of us from the way we are brought up. In general, teachers were more obedient when authority figures were nearby. They could pass off the responsibility for their actions, and when they were not able to see the student to whom they were administering shocks. This brings up several ethical issues. 1. Deception. The participants actually believed they were shocking a real person and were unaware that the learner was an individual who was part of the research team. Another issue is protection of the participants. Participants were exposed to extremely stressful situations that may have the potential to cause psychological harm. Many of the participants were visibly distressed during the testing. Signs of tension included trembling, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, biting lip, and the digging of fingernails into the palm of the hand. 3 participants had uncontrollable seizures, and many pleaded to be allowed to stop the experiment. Milgram did debrief the participants fully after the experiment and also followed up after a period of time to ensure that the individuals who participated in the study came to no harm. The Zimbardo's Prison Study. Zimbardo and his colleagues in 1973 were interested in finding out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personality of the guards, such as a dispositional trait, or had more to do with the prison environment, which would be a situational trait. For example, prisoner and guards may have personalities which make conflict inevitable, with prisoners lacking respect for the law and order, and guards being domineering and aggressive. Alternately, prisoners and guards may behave in a hostile manner due to the rigid power structure of the social environment of prisons. To study the roles people play in prison situations, Zimbardo converted a basement of the Stanford University Psychology Building into a mock prison. He advertised asking for volunteers to participate in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. The 75 applicants who answered the ad were given diagnostic interviews and personality tests to eliminate candidates with psychological problems, medical disabilities, or a history of crime and drug abuse. 24 men, judged to be the most physically and mentally stable, the most mature, and the least involved in antisocial behaviors, were chosen to participate. The participants did not know each other prior to the study and were paid $15 per day to take part in the experiment. Participants were randomly assigned to either role of a prisoner or guard in a simulated prison environment. There were 2 reserves and 1 dropped out, finally leaving 10 prisoners and 11 guards. Prisoners were treated like every other criminal, being arrested in their own homes without warning and taken to the local police station. There they were fingerprinted, photographed, and booked. They were then blindfolded and driven to the psychology department of Stanford University, where Zimbardo had the basement set out as a prison with barred doors and windows, bare walls, and small cells. Zimbardo observed the behavior of the prisoners and the guards as a researcher and also acted as the prison warden. Within a very short time, both guards and prisoners were settling into their new roles, with the guards adopting theirs quickly and easily. The study was designed to last 14 days, but had to be stopped after only 6. Those playing the role of the guard were becoming increasingly abusive to the prisoners. Those who were playing the role of the prisoners were displaying signs of extreme stress and anxiety. Given the power, guards acted more aggressively than they did in their normal lives. Lacking power, the prisoners were more passive and depressed than they were prior to the experiment. According to Zimbardo and his colleagues, the Stanford Prison Experiment revealed how people will readily conform to the societal roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of prison guard. Because the guards were placed in a position of authority, they began to act in ways that they would not usually behave in their normal lives. This study has received many ethical criticisms, including the lack of fully informed consent by participants, as Zimbardo himself did not know what would happen in the experiment. It was unpredictable. Also, the prisoners did not consent to being arrested at home. The prisoners were not told, partly because of final approval from the police was not given until minutes before the participants decided to participate, and partly because the researchers wanted the arrest to come as a surprise. However, this was a breach of the ethics of Zimbardo's own contract that all of the participants had signed. Participants playing the role of the prisoners were not protected from psychological harm, experiencing incidences of humiliation and distress. So how does unethical research get addressed? Let's talk a little further. The Nuremberg trials were trials that took place after World War II to bring justice to Nazi leaders who committed thousands, if not millions, of heinous crimes against humanity. Part of the trials included the introduction of the Nuremberg Code, which described the minimal standards needed when conducting research with human subjects. The Nuremberg Code was drafted at the end of the doctor's trial in Nuremberg in 1947 and was hailed as a landmark document in medical and research ethics. Close examinations of this code revealed that it was based on the guidelines for human experimentation in 1931. The Nuremberg Code is aimed to protect human subjects from enduring the kind of cruelty and exploitation the prisoners endured at concentration camps. The 10 elements of the code are: 1. Voluntary consent is essential. 2. The results of any experiment must be for the greater good of society. 3. Human experiments should be based on previous animal experimentation. 4. Experiments should be conducted by avoiding physical and mental suffering and injury. 5. No experiments should be conducted if it is believed to cause death or disability. 6. The risks should never exceed the benefits. 7. Adequate facilities should be used to protect subjects. 8. Experiments should be conducted only by qualified scientists. 9. Subjects should be able to end their participation at any time. And 10. The scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment when injury, disability, or death is likely to occur. As we talk about ethics, there are several elements to informed consent. Individuals must be educated on the purpose of the research, the procedures to be implemented. They must know that they have voluntary participation, and they have the right to withdraw their participation at any point during the study. They also have a right to understand how this information will be used and how their privacy will be maintained. They have the option to opt out of the study at any point. Additionally, there should be some contact information for the researcher if the individual has questions at a later point. The National Institute of Health has also helped to try to limit unethical behaviors in research practices. In the mid-1950s, the Clinical Research Center, or the CRC, at the National Institute of Health was created to oversee the conduct of clinical research. In 1964, an ethics committee was formed to ensure that all research funded by public health services was to be reviewed for ethical standards. And there is an establishment of there is a formal review process for all research conducted nationwide. There is a Declaration of Helsinki. The World Medical Association met in Helsinki, Finland in 1964. They created a document that builds on the 3 basic principles in the Nuremberg Code, but added 2 new standards. These include the interests of the subject should be given higher priority than the interest of society, and every subject in a clinical research trial should get the best known treatment available. We also have the National Research Act. The National Research Act of 1974 established the formation of the Modern Institutional Review Board, or IRB. IRB approval is needed to conduct most kinds of research involving human subjects. The IRB ensures that the policies and procedures are followed when instituting research. It is a criteria that IRBs use to approve the research conduct. The IRB approval process. IRB research proposals are submitted, and one of three things can happen. The proposal is sent back with suggested changes. The proposal is approved and you can conduct your study as planned. Or the proposal is denied and you cannot conduct your study. If the proposal is sent back with suggested changes, the research is needed to be revised and resubmitted for review. It goes back to the IRB and then is sent back with one of the three following and is either sent back again with changes, approved, or is denied. So some things I want you to think about as you're listening to this lecture. What is your understanding of these terms? What does it mean to have respect? What does harm mean? And what does fairness mean? These are all important aspects of research and things that we must define in order to have a quality and ethical research study. The Belmont Report. In 1979, the Belmont Report indicated ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects of research. The fundamental principles included respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The respect for persons indicates that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. They have voluntary participation in research. We need to honor the individual's privacy, and we need to maintain confidentiality. Individuals with diminished autonomy are entitled to added protection. These individuals include children, the elderly, individuals who are mentally impaired, individuals incarcerated, or pregnant women. This added level of protection often requires additional signatures or additional understanding of the circumstance and approval prior to being a study subject. Beneficence indicates that no person shall be placed at risk unless the risks exposed to are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits. There should be a benefit realized by the participants who take part in the particular research study. A benefit or benefits received can either be psychological or tangible in nature. In some cases, we pay subjects, but we need to make sure that the amount that we're paying them does not outweigh the risk of the study. There are several categorizations of risk. Minimal risk indicates that the risk of harm is not greater, considering probability and magnitude, than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. More than minimal risk, risks exceed, either in probability or magnitude, those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests. So some potential risks that we could discuss. These include invasion of privacy, breach of confidentiality, embarrassment, a stigma of being associated with the study, and psychological trauma. As you can see from some of the studies that we've discussed already, these issues arose in the study methodology. Justice. The risks and benefits should be justly distributed. In other words, who ought to receive the benefit of the research and who should bear the burdens? It's important that no single population should bear the burden of research. For example, risks associated with participation. A bias to the knowledge base develops when one population is studied more than another. We also have to consider reflexivity. This includes power and voice. Reflexivity is the process of continued reflection upon a research process by a researcher. At the heart of reflexivity is the idea of self-awareness. Being reflexive means being attentive to cultural, political, social, and ideological origins of your own perspective and your voice, the perspectives and voices of those you interview or observe, and the perspectives of those to whom you report your research. Reflexivity can be divided into two types, prospective and retrospective. Prospective reflexivity refers to the effects of the researcher on the study, whereas retrospective reflexivity refers to the effects of the study on the researcher. When we examine power, we need to examine hierarchy and authority. As for voice, we need to look for marginalization and politics influencing our researchers. We need to look at marginalization and politics influencing our research methodology or our outcome or our reporting of the results. Researchers can practice reflexivity in their research in several ways, such as keeping a journal, maintaining open dialogue and discussion with their colleagues, or simply by internally reflecting on the research process. So why is this needed for federal regulations? As we can see, the history of human subject abuse and exploitation of vulnerable populations has occurred. If we do not have an adequate process for informed consent, we place our participants at risk. We need to be careful of coercion and deception. We also need to examine the boundaries between research and therapy. The privacy and data security is extremely important. We also need to examine the responsibility to the public who funds our research and know that we are accountable for our actions. All in all, ethics are extremely important and is something that you should look at as you're examining research in the future and throughout this class.